100 years ago, people treated diabetes completely differently. Before we had modern drugs to cover the problem, before we were afraid of fat, here is a cookbook for diabetes from 1917. You can read it online if you like. I'm just going to show you the most interesting thing, which is page 12 and 13. To the left, the foods you are supposed to eat. To the right, the foods you are not supposed to eat. So have a look to the right. Foods that you should not eat. Number 1 is sugar. Number 2 is starchy foods. And you have examples like flour, bread, biscuits, rice, and macaroni, what we call pasta today. Check out the headline on this page. Foods strictly forbidden, which is now the base of the food pyramid, the largest part of my plate, you know. When we have an explosion of diabetes all around the world, people are getting sicker and sicker. I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I think it's the cause. So look to the left. What were people supposed to be eating back then? What is it? Butter, olive oil, cheese, meat, fish, and eggs. Yeah, and if we only add a bunch of vegetables to this, then it's low carb, high fat, right? Same advice I've given to patients for 10 years. And everybody with diabetes who tested this got better blood sugar.
When you are given the pamphlet from the doctor, because if you ask him, well, doctor, okay, I want to do something else instead of just taking medication, what can I do? He'll hand you a pamphlet from the Diabetes Association. Well, that diet has artificial sweeteners involved with it. That diet tells you to lower fat, which you're all going to learn in a moment, that low fat actually can cause diabetes. That diet puts you on other fats and says eat more of these polyunsaturated fats, which we know cause diabetes. And it actually tells you to avoid fats that we know actually prevent it. Let's talk about the grains, because I think that the other thing that's very promoted is whole grains. You know, eat whole grains. And I mean, whole grains are healthier for certain things. They do offer more fiber. However, for a diabetic, whole grains are just as damaging as regular sugar. Just as damaging as regular sugar. I didn't say white bread, folks. I said whole grain bread. I think the best example is 2 slices of whole wheat bread are equivalent to drinking a 12-ounce soda.
Wow.
Yeah, so you could do the test yourself. You could eat a bowl of oatmeal. An hour later, do a finger prick and check your glucose. 2 hours later, do a finger prick and check your glucose, okay? Do the same thing after drinking a Pepsi, okay? Or a white bowl of pasta, or just sugar. You will see that whole grain breads, especially if you have a diabetic condition.
The American Diabetes Association guidelines specifically state that there is inconclusive evidence to recommend a specific carbohydrate limit. But those guidelines go right on to say what we all know. Carbohydrate intake is the single biggest factor in blood sugar levels and therefore need for medication. These guidelines then go on to say, hey, look, if you're taking certain diabetic medications, you actually have to eat carbs. Let's take a look at the vicious cycle that advice just set up. So it's eat carbs, so you have to take medicine. Then you have to eat more carbs so you avoid the side effect of those medications. And around we go. We are continuing to recommend to patients to consume close to, if not more, than half of their total energy intake every day from them. It doesn't make sense.
When they get this diet, this recommended diet, you know, I just heard you say things like bad fats, like artificial sweeteners, which would also be a toxin. So
yeah, and they're recommending, the Diabetes Association is recommending this diet.
Yeah, and bottom line, it's driving what we know to be inflammation, right? And diabetes is absolutely an inflammatory disease, and so that is driving the very thing of what they went in for. It's baffling.
Yeah.
Yes, we are essentially recommending that they eat exactly what's causing their problem. Sound crazy? It really, really is. So why, oh why, do we want to continue to recommend to people to eat them?
Why would the Diabetes Association recommend a diet that not only doesn't prevent diabetes, doesn't reverse diabetes, but actually can cause it.
Right.
Here is a brochure from Sweden. It says food for people with diabetes. And you can see, you see the fruit and you know what's coming, right? It says foods that raises the blood sugar slowly is good. And what is that? Fruit, rice, pasta, potatoes, and bread. Oh, it does. It raises the blood sugar for sure. So who gives out these brochures for free? Who is printing them? It is a pharmaceutical company, right? So they sell drugs for lowering blood sugar, and then they hand out brochures to help people raise their blood sugar. So people with diabetes get sicker, blood sugar goes up, they need more drugs, company makes more money, shareholders are very happy, everybody else loses. I don't think pharmaceutical companies should have anything to do with dietary guidelines or lifestyle guidance at all.
The whole low-fat thing, it's really been proven wrong in science for so many years now, but yet watch your television, whatever you read, they're still talking about low-fat for weight loss, heart disease, etc., etc. When we know now it's not about low-fat at all. Matter of fact, low-fat diets arguably are causing so many of the diseases that we're seeing today, even including diabetes.
Let's focus just on type 2 diabetes.
Type 2 diabetes, they have plenty of insulin. Okay, the problem is the cell cannot hear this hormone, insulin.
At its root, diabetes is a state of carbohydrate toxicity. We can't get the blood sugar into the cells.
The problem is the hormone receptors, meaning the things that communicate with the hormone on the cell.
Yeah.
Well, what happens is every time you raise up glucose, it causes a blunting of these receptors.
Yes.
Meaning the receptors, imagine them covering them, then they can't communicate with the hormone.
That is the problem in diabetes. Because glucose is there outside the cell trying to get inside. In order to get in, it needs a key, and that key is insulin. Now, what if I get home, and I'm getting up to my front door, and I take my key out of my pocket, I put it in the front door. Wait a minute, it's not working. And there's nothing wrong with my key, but I look in the lock, and while I was gone, somebody put chewing gum in my lock. So what am I going to do? Crawl in and out the window? No, I'm going to clean out the lock.
Drugs don't actually do anything for the disease. So if you have very high insulin resistance, it's going to cause high blood sugar, right? But that's the symptom of the disease. The disease is actually too much insulin resistance. So what happens is that because we're not treating the disease tends to progress. So if you look at what happens over a period of 10 years, 15 years, what happens is that you start off with one medication, then you take 2 medications, then 3, then you're taking more medication to do the same job, to keep that blood sugar the same. That means your diabetes is worse. Even if your blood sugar is better, your diabetes is worse than it's ever been because you've never actually done anything about treating the insulin resistance. So that patient who went and lost weight and exercised and cut out the carbs and cut out the sugars, they actually reversed their insulin resistance and therefore their sugars came down, which is far different than making your blood sugars go down by force, by medication, and ignoring the actual disease.
So giving more hormones isn't the answer. It's getting the cell to communicate better with the hormone. That's really the answer to this problem.
But what if we trace this problem back to the beginning and we just didn't have so much glucose around that insulin needed to deal with? Let's take a look at how that could be. Everything you eat is either a carbohydrate, a protein, or a fat. And they all have a very different effect on glucose and therefore insulin levels, as you can see on the graph. So when we eat carbohydrates, our insulin and glucose are going to spike up fast. And with proteins, it looks a lot better. But take a look at what happens when we eat fat. Essentially nothing, a flat line. And this is going to wind up being very important. So what does this look like then? How does somebody eat this way? Well, first let me tell you what it's not. Low carb is not zero carb, and it is not high protein. These are common criticisms that are so frustrating because they're not true. Next, if we take the carbs out, what are we going to put in? Because remember, there's only 3 macronutrients. If one goes down, one has to go up. My patients eat fat. What, you say? I mean, what's going to happen when you eat fat? Well, let me tell you, you're going to be happy. Fat is the only macronutrient that's going to keep our glucose, blood sugar, and insulin levels low, and that is so important. So I want you to now hear my simple rules for eating. These rules, you have to remember, are even going to be more important if you are one of the tens of millions of Americans who have trouble with insulin levels. Rule number one, if it says light, low fat, or fat-free, stays in the grocery store, because if they took the fat out, they put carbs and chemicals in. Rule number two, eat food. Don't eat anything you don't like. Don't eat anything you don't like. The most important rule in low-carb nutrition: real food does not come in a box, and no one should have to tell you real food is natural. You should know that when you look at it.
Some people will say, well, a potato, it grows in the ground. It can't get more natural than that. But because of the state the body is in, it's a poison to the body while it's in that state.
Yeah.
Number 5 is a simple way to remember what we want to avoid. No GPS. No grains, no potatoes, and no sugar. That last one is a biggie, right? No grains? Yeah, no grains. But we have to have them. Nope, they're a carb. But whole grains are so good for us.
Whole grains are just as damaging as regular sugar.
First of all, there are actually very few foods out there that are truly whole grain, even when they say they are. Most foods that purport themselves to be whole grain are highly processed and the fiber benefit ruined, or they're coming with highly refined flour. Usually both of these things. So if you are one of the truly insulin-sensitive people, you can eat real whole grain. But if you are in the enormous slice of our population with insulin issues, it's making things worse. Over a year ago, I decided I would cut my carbs as low as I recommend to my diabetic patients. Now, it's not mandatory for my health like it is for theirs. I'm not insulin resistant, so would this be a problem? No, that's just the thing. Unless you have an exceedingly rare syndrome, then cutting carbs is going to be good for you, even if it's not necessary. But what about the research on this? I mean, is this just anecdotal evidence now from my clinic? No. There are dozens of randomized controlled trials looking at low-carb intervention for things like diabetes, cardiovascular risk factors, obesity. They're consistent. It works. There are even a large number of studies showing that low-carb nutrition decreases inflammatory markers, which is making it really exciting for diseases like cancer. We just finished a study in our clinic, and what we did is we took 50 type 2 diabetic patients that were treated with our low-carb, high-fat-based program, and we compared them to 50 patients who were treated with the ADA guidelines. The low-carb group was able to decrease their insulin by almost 500 units a day, whereas in the ADA-treated group, they had to increase their insulin by almost 350 units a day. Two important things. Number one, insulin's expensive. And number two, not all the people in this study were even on insulin, which makes these results even more impressive. But what I would say is that this graph really represents two different approaches to treating this disease. The first, our group with the goal of reversing disease, meaning they need less medicine. And the second group, which very clearly aligns with the ADA guidelines, which states that diabetes is a progressive disease requiring more medicine over time. Progressive, unless we take away the cause. We got this notion that low fat was the way to go decades ago, but a recent study just came out showing that there was zero randomized control evidence to recommend to Americans to remove the fat from our diet.
We know now it's not about low fat at all. Matter of fact, low fat diets arguably are causing so many of the diseases that we're seeing today, even including diabetes.
Even worse is that nowhere in the ADA guidelines is the goal of reversing type 2 diabetes. This needs to be changed because type 2 diabetes can be reversed.
The diabetes itself is actually quite reversible, and that's one of the things that I realized a short while ago. And that whether it's the American Diabetes Association or the Diabetes Australia, they all put out there that this is a chronic disease. And they tell people essentially that you have diabetes, you'll have it for the rest of your life, you might as well get used to it. But the problem is that that's simply not true.
There's a big problem with low carb, especially in America, in my experience. Eenfeldt's pasta. And this is of course not the only problem, but this is a very good example of the problem. Because this is marketed as a low-carb pasta, only it's made from wheat, like any pasta. How is this possible? Well, they have a patent-pending process, they say, for making the pasta, the wheat, undigestible. So, most of these carbs are going to be protected, and they're going to pass through your system, and only small amount of carbs are going to be absorbed. And this sounds too good to be true. In fact, I know it's too good to be true because I tested this pasta myself and it didn't work. Although you don't have to take my word for it, because this is such a good example, because this has been tested by real scientists in a very nice journal called Diabetic Care. Actually, some low-carb researchers who were surprised by this idea that you could eat pasta on a low-carb diet. So they wanted to get the data from the company to take a look, but they wouldn't give it out. So they had to test it themselves, and they used 10 volunteers who ate the Eenfeldt's pasta and regular pasta at different times, and they checked the blood sugar. Do you know what they found? They didn't find any difference whatsoever, which is amazing to me. Carb fact, it says, I think it's not carb fact, I think it's carb fiction, I think it's a fairy tale for people who want to eat pasta on their low-carb diets. Of course, they want to believe it. And there's lots of these low-carb fairy tales out there. 3 quick examples. This is bread made from wheat flour, and it's called low-carb bread. I'd say it's a high-carb bread. Here we have ice cream made from actually some real sugar and lots of sugar alcohols. I'd say that's a high-carb product. And even the Atkins company are disgracing themselves by selling Atkins cookies. You know what the biggest ingredient in these cookies are? Can you guess? It's wheat flour. And another big ingredient is sugar alcohols. So it's basically all carbs. And this is a low-carb company selling high-carb cookies. Not good. I think we really have to focus on real foods like meat, fish, vegetables, and perhaps, if you dare, butter.